So we know that using turpentine as a fuel is both technically feasible and potentially capable of rather large reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. It sounds like a fantastic idea, on paper at least. However, what would be the financial cost of such a project? Wide-reaching projects such as this must balance social and environmental damage. Today on Let's Wade Through, we'll have a swing at finding a number for the cost of this enterprise. Finding a number like this is rather hard to do. Without the aid of economic simulation programs, vast amounts of time and data, and an understanding of statistics, net benefit isn't easy to do. But when has that ever stopped anyone, really? The previous video asserts that the turpentine for diesel would need to be imported as there's not enough available pine in the US to produce it domestically. Therefore, the economic effect seen from importing oil works as a functional analogy for importing large volumes of expensive turpentine. The trick here is to take some useful part of fuel consumption and plot that against GDP, somehow, to find any relations that show up. GDP is the gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced within the borders of a given country. Luckily for us, Michael Ocott and Charles Hall did exactly this. They tracked the changes in GDP compared to the percentage of GDP spent on fuel between 1950 and 2013. A little bit of background before we get to the results. Oil itself represents the largest influence on the price of fuels. In 2013, American oil refineries spent nearly $700 billion on crude oil. This raw price accounts for 4% of GDP. Changes in economic activity, specifically recessions, are greatly influenced by the price of oil. A drop in GDP has followed oil price spikes somewhat reliably for the last 10 out of 11 recessionary events for most of the Western world. Now, 4% doesn't sound like much, but oil, as a form of energy, has a fantastic amount of leverage over economies. It impacts nearly every sector of the economy. Anytime a part or a widget or a product is shipped from one location to the next, fuels eat a little bit more into the profits of that transaction. Tourism, recreation, even the sale of automobiles and automobile parts follow fuel costs. The auto industry directly employs some odd million people or so. Trucking employs some 8 million people. It should be clear now that there are a lot of jobs dependent on inexpensive fuel. This paper noted 3 particularly interesting values of fuel spending as a percentage of GDP. Below 3%, GDP growth was excellent. At 4%, GDP growth staggered. At 5%, GDP growth sank like a stone. Up to 1974, fuel is below the 3% mark, and GDP growth is commonly above 4% yearly, with a 5-year average always above 2%. However, when the oil crisis hit and fuels breached 5% in 1979, GDP tumbled. At the highest 5-year average for fuels, at 7% in 1982, GDP experienced zero growth. Again, for a 5-year period, average growth was nothing. Fuel began falling rather quickly from this high, and GDP growth recovered. After this period, there is an inverse relationship between fuel costs and GDP growth, with a boundary at 5% that ushers a recession whenever it is breached. The dot-com bubble of the late 90s had the lowest fuel costs since the 1960s. Much of the latter half of the boom was driven by large-scale equipment purchases and dependent on cheap fuel for shipping. When fuel prices rose again prior to the Great Recession, well, you can guess what happened there. Twice in the last 41 years, when the percentage of GDP spent on fuel hit 5%, the economy suffered quickly and significantly. Using 2015 transportation fuel estimates as an average benchmark, the fact that diesel and gasoline have followed each other closely in price, and applying a little bit of maths, diesel represents roughly 1 percentage point of present fuel as GDP. If this holds true historically, then the implementation of turpentine as a fuel at 75% would have been disastrous. Present costs of turpentine are about twice that of conventional diesel. Therefore, a substitution of 75% would increase the price by 75%. The total effect of this price increase on fuels spent as a percentage of GDP would nearly be a full percentage point. On a scale of 3 to 5%, this is a huge amount. Specifically, it would push fuels up to the 5% mark twice in a 3-year period after the initial 7% peak, the first in 1987 and the second in 1990. That would have made quick work of this recovery during its peak. The fuel percentage would not stay reliably under 5% until 1991, while only briefly dipping below 4% in 1988. This would represent a hypothetical 12-year era of damagingly expensive fuel costs. The most important thing about this hypothetical TERPS edition at this moment in time has to do with what this recovery did for the American technology sector. AOL got its start during this time, albeit under a different name, and Microsoft started on their current form. Cisco, a major producer of internet hardware, was founded during this recovery. Dell introduced their first personal computer during this time. A Bureau and Labor Statistics report from 1990 detailed the previous decade as having a 182% growth in employment in the computer and data processing services industries. All of these companies would end up playing major roles in the dot-com bubble some 10 years later. Essentially, the American computing industry in its modern form was founded and forged during this short window of time. Therefore, the dot-com bubble is linked to this period of recovery. These companies, these technological powerhouses, would not have had the capital or the economic opportunity to grow as they did. How would the dot-com bubble have played out? AOL spread internet connectivity to tens of millions of Americans. How could Google have succeeded without their help? Would Silicon Valley reside closer to CERN instead of in California? When TERPS is maximized at 75% addition for environmental benefits, it just isn't an economical idea at all. A TERPS addition at 5%, however, the minimum amount required to provide emissions benefits, would be very well tolerated by the American economy. This minor rise in fuel costs isn't enough to drastically change fuel costs as a percentage of GDP. It seems using TERPS at 5%, all things considered, might truly be a feasible way to reduce some small amount of diesel-sourced pollution.